Let's start, though, with WestJet's decision to slash service in Atlantic Canada. The airline will soon no longer fly to Moncton, Fredericton, Sydney, Charlottetown, and Quebec City, and drastically cut back its service to St. John's and Halifax. In the end, a total of 100 flights, or 80% of the airline's service in and out of Atlantic Canada, will be affected. According to WestJet, demand was, quote, obliterated by the Atlantic bubble, as well as fee increases by a number of airports. Blaine Higgs is the Premier of New Brunswick. He joins us from Fredericton to talk about this a bit more. Hi, Premier Higgs. Good to see you as always.
Good evening, Darcy.
How big of an impact will this have economically on your province, do you think?
Well, it's certainly significant. There's no question. I mean, but the impact of the airports and the lack of activity there in the last 7-8 months is certainly real. I mean, it's very real with everyone, but not just here in New Brunswick. But this is, it's kind of like, when do we see this coming back, and what should we look at differently as a result? COVID has caused us to look at many activities in a different way, and I think air travel in the Maritimes has got to be another one of them, and particularly how that relates to activity here in New Brunswick.
Okay, I want to dig into that a bit more, and first just ask you, I mean, we had WestJet, we heard them lay out their reasons for making this decision, and one of those reasons was the Atlantic bubble. So that's essentially the travel restrictions that you and your province and other provinces have brought into effect through this pandemic. Has this given you some second thought about the bubble?
Well, no, I don't think so, Vassie. It's certainly it's been a balancing act. Is true enough. We were hopeful that we were going to start to open up with the rest of Canada back maybe 2 months ago. I would say midsummer. Things were looking very good, and then things started to kind of break loose in the rest of the country, and now we're having our own second wave here that we think we're getting a grip on it. We've got great people tracking in the field and contact tracing and testing, but it's a balancing act, and we were recovering well. 80% of our businesses are back up and running, and we were hopeful. So it's delayed in terms of air travel to open up to the rest of the country and open our bubble, But I think that what we're seeing here is a situation that air travel is not going to be the same for a long time. I don't think we're talking months. I mean, I think we're talking years. And we've got to figure out what is the best situation right now to provide the best service to all of New Brunswickers and certainly Atlantic Canadians in that sense as well, being in the bubble.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm getting at. I mean, is it not, I guess, logical that they would not be able or they would not consider it viable if travel is so restricted? Like it follows that would be the case.
It's certainly a factor. I do agree, and I would like to think that we'll be able to move away from that issue. And I'm hopeful. As I said, I thought I was there last summer. I'd like to think we'll be there in the next few months, that we'll be able to open up to the rest of Canada. But we will see caseloads drop in the other provinces. I mean, because we're certainly being very aware of the condition in Quebec, and I mean, we've actually strengthened our borders between Quebec and New Brunswick, and we're very concerned about the U.S. and our border with Maine. So we continue to have all around us some very severe, significant situations, and we're feeling it ourselves. So this isn't a time that we can just throw out what has kept us safe to date. So we do hope to continue to move forward and ultimately get our airports back in business, or to look strategically at how we get the best connection for citizens here in our province.
Before I ask you a bit more about the airlines, you mentioned some of what's transpiring outside of your province's border. Do you anticipate any changes to any of the restrictions that are in place in New Brunswick around travel before the end of the year?
I would like to think so. I would like to say, by December, we'll be able to do something a little differently. I know that's only a couple months away, so it's we got to see some significant changes. Our situation get under control, and then in discussion with my colleagues in Atlantic Canada, the way we can move together, because we've been successful doing that, and see the situation across the country subside. But I would like to think, I want to get reconnected. There's no question about it.
So you think it's possible that the travel restrictions could be lifted?
Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I guess I would have some reservations, but it is possible.
Okay, on the airline question, when you talked about sort of coming up with an interim solution or something that maybe strategically helps before air travel resumes, which, as you, I think, rightly point out, won't be for a very long time. Have there been any discussions with the federal government? We've spoken to the minister frequently on this show, asked, is there some sort of bailout or different type of structured loan program coming? They're considering everything, and they have been for months, but nothing specific has come from the federal government yet. Have you had any conversations with them about that?
Well, yes, in fact, very recently. In fact, I just got off of a long call with Minister LeBlanc, and this was one of the items on our agenda. So we had a lengthy discussion, and you know, it's a challenging situation for the federal government to decide how do we best do that. I know airlines have been certainly profitable prior to COVID, and there's some strategic things changing, and we see acquisitions still happening, and so it is a balancing. And how do they do this? Because is it a short-term fix? You know, when you invest in an airline, if you look at the airport structures and you say, okay, even if we do that, are we going to see these activities resume in our province? So the conversation we had was a lot around. They haven't made a decision yet how the package would look, but I think they're very committed to something's going to happen with the air industry. But I think it's strategically also looking at the bigger picture, and we need to figure out if we're going to be years here in resuming and people feeling comfortable really getting back into air travel, how do we get the best service and provide that security and comfort in a reasonable fashion, in a reasonable time frame, because it's so critical to getting our economy up. We're at 80% open right now. We need to be 100%.
Do you believe there needs to be some sort of bailout for airlines?
Well, I think we have to be cautious about that. I think it is strategic to look at what's going to come from that. You know, is WestJet going to resume their operations? Are we going to see more travel on the planes? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we'll get back in business, but if no one is going to use the service, it doesn't change anything. So I think it has to be strategic, and I'm willing certainly to work with the federal government in that regard. We all are concerned about this move from WestJet. There's no question about that, and it has a huge impact. But the fact that they did it is because the planes are empty, and so just putting them back in the air and traveling here, it doesn't change that. So unless there's some issues that come along with it, and people feel comfortable traveling again, and to your point about the bubble, and we're able to make some changes there, then how much is really going to benefit from a huge cash injection? I'm not saying there's not money needed. I think there likely is, but it has to come with the reality of what's going to change.
You mentioned Minister LeBlanc. We had him on the show last night. He's the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs federally. He's going to be on the call Thursday with, which I guess is tomorrow, with you and the other premiers and the Prime Minister. He told us that one point of conversation will certainly be long-term care standards, national standards, which the government indicated in the throne speech they wanted to bring in. He said he's hopeful that those can come in a matter of weeks rather than months. Are you willing, in exchange for targeted funding, for example, for care homes or long-term care in general, to accept national standards?
Well, I think it's a very valid discussion to be had. I know these are provincial jurisdictions, but I don't think we should get hung up in that aspect of it. But I think we should base these discussions on lessons learned through the pandemic. And, you know, we've all, in our case, you know, so far we haven't had an outbreak in nursing homes. We've had situations in 3 long-term care facilities. But it's basically, it's again, what have we learned? What should we change? In different provinces, there's different dynamics, and demographically, you know, we have some big challenges here. Throwing money at a situation, building more nursing homes or building more senior cares, it's not going to necessarily change if we can't get the people that are going to be able to work in them. And I think we need alternate levels of support. So I am very willing to have those discussions and have the people that are more knowledgeable than I in what's best practices should look like. What have we learned from COVID? How do we apply that? I got every indication from Minister LeBlanc that is the tone that the PM wants to take. It's not a download. It's not a prescription of, you know, you do this and we'll send money. It's like, okay, we've had an experience here that we don't want to repeat. What can we learn from that, and how can we build on it? And then how do we work together? Because as a smaller province, we need to ensure that national standards exist. and we need to ensure that there's a fairness across our country. That's why we pride ourselves in being Canadians. And so I'm interested in ensuring that I have the capability to maintain those standards here in New Brunswick. And because there's certain areas I can't compete with the bigger provinces. And so we have to be proud of being a nation and reflect that in our ability to work with one another on best practices.
Okay, Premier, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time, but I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a good evening.
Blaine Higgs is, of course, the Premier of New Brunswick.
Effective Monday, November the 2nd, we will suspend service to Moncton and Fredericton, New Brunswick, to Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Charlottetown on Prince Edward Island, and to Quebec City. Services to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and St. John's, Newfoundland will continue, albeit with dramatically reduced frequency.
Harsh news for Atlantic Canadians today as WestJet cut several flights to the region. The airline blames the lack of rapid testing and quarantine requirements for the drop-off in travel to and from the Atlantic bubble. Premiers are pushing for federal action to support the travel and tourism sectors. Might this be the tipping point? Time for the Power Panel. Over in Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is here in Ottawa, as are Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group and Sherelle Evelyn, managing editor of The Hill Times. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you on this Wednesday. Tim, I'm sure none of our viewers know this, but of course you are from Newfoundland, so I'm guessing you're taking this pretty personally.
Oh, Vashi, so everybody else has ceded their time to me. Thank you for that. I'll only take 12 minutes to rant about all of this. So normally I would be with my people, fully on side, condemning the airlines. Listen, I've probably flown every route in Atlantic Canada multiple times. So normally I get it, and normally I'd be mad at the airlines. I'd be mad at WestJet, although that guy sounded like he was with British Airways, but they don't even fly to Atlantic Canada at all. But here's the real issue. WestJet is right? This is the benefit of the Atlantic bubble for Atlantic Canadians is they've kept COVID at bay for the most part, and that has had its consequence. And today we're seeing a consequence, and that is these airlines, WestJet is the first to say, look, we don't have the volume to go in and out. We can't, because you're restricting travel for meritorious public health reasons, but there's a consequence. This is going to cost, or is already costing, Atlantic airports $76 million. But I do suspect the federal government is going to try and compel WestJet and others to act here. Why? Because over 80% of Atlantic Canadians think the Atlantic bubble's a good idea and good politics. So watch for Marc Garneau, Dominic LeBlanc, and others to come on side and support this lunacy of keeping this thing going while the economy, as it is suffering dramaamatically.
So this brings about a number, I think, of interesting discussion points. Amanda, we spoke to Premier Blaine Higgs a few minutes ago on the show. He seems to want the Atlantic bubble to relax its travel restrictions if warranted. But right now, if you take a look at some of the provinces around New Brunswick, for example, like Quebec, you can understand, I think, some of their hesitancy to break down some of those travel barriers. So he seemed kind of resigned to the fact that there wouldn't be a lot of people on those planes for a long time, which certainly places a big burden on the federal government.
I mean, I think it does and it doesn't. I agree with Tim. This is a natural consequence of the decisions that have been made to protect the Atlantic provinces health-wise. But for me, thinking about the idea of the federal government pumping dollars into empty planes where there isn't any demand and too many restrictions for Canadians to get into the Atlantic provinces with the self-isolation, the 14-day quarantine, doesn't make any sense. There are needs across the country right now where those dollars effectively need to go. I mean, this again is the natural consequence that WestJet took a look at, and they said, we've already reduced this down to 2 flights a week. And they're not full. They're empty flights. So it doesn't make any sense until either there's a different type of testing or the restrictions come down for these flights to resume. And at that point, maybe the federal government chooses that as the juncture in a recovery effort to help stimulate both the economy and the tourism industry and travel amongst at least provinces and Canadians in order to, to reverse some of the trend that we're seeing. But until then, I think that those provinces have to rely on the universal supports that are out there, whether that's the wage subsidy or other programs that are really directed at businesses large and small.
You raise a good point about the federal government's potential involvement or not. And Sharella, I was hoping you could weigh in on this as well. We've had federal ministers on here often who definitely don't rule out some sort of so-called bailout, but clearly it's not something that's going to happen right away, or it hasn't been over the past 6 months. Like, they're taking their time with it. Premier Higgs said he spoke at length with Dominic LeBlanc, Minister LeBlanc, yesterday, and that there's something in the works, some sort of package, but even Premier Higgs was like, it needs to be very strategic. Just what Amanda said, basically, like, don't pump money into an airline that has no people flying or no people flying on the planes. Like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the federal government has been really resistant in terms of sector-specific bailouts, if you will. You know, people have been calling for specific help for, say, the oil and gas industry and for the airlines, and it has not been coming. I think one of the last few targeted things for airlines that the government announced was back in the early spring, where they waived the rents for, I think it's about 21 airports that are in the national airport system, and that's been about it. And they've, like you said, they've kind of gone and said, well, okay, look at, the wage subsidy program and other programs that cover a broad base of businesses. And so they've been really resistant. They did signal in the throne speech, though, that, support of some kind for the airlines is coming, and talking about the importance of regional connections and things like that. But we've heard this before. They've said, support for certain areas, whether it was oil and gas or what have you, it's in the coming days, it's days away. And then now months later, we're still, kind of looking to see what's on the horizon, and there isn't anything there. So maybe this move by WestJet will kind of be that final push that actually does get whatever package rolling, but we also might not see it, and they might be looking to, ride it out and see what happens.
Politically, there's sort of two ways to look at it, Kathleen. On the one hand, I mean, the reality is there are two airlines, basically, major airlines in this country. Mm-hmm. And if one or more of them fail, that's a huge problem. The other way to look at it is that there is a big issue with public sentiment around bailouts in this country. And it, in fact, has been a part of campaigns in the past few years. People are pretty upset at the way those bailouts have worked in the past decade, you could argue, even before then, and how few strings were attached to the money that was lent or given, whatever the way it ended up going. So I wonder if that kind of bears on the government's decision making as well.
That might, in fact, be why they're approaching this problem so slowly. And it has taken, the first sectoral packages were promised back by former Finance Minister Bill Morneau back in March, right? And we're still waiting on them, as Sharelle pointed out. I think it's important, though, to separate this news today out of WestJet and from the Atlantic bubble conversation, which I know is basically all Tim wants to talk about all the time, which I understand. He wants to go visit his mom. But if you separate it and actually look across the country, there have been regional routes canceled from different carriers across the country. This is a very big problem, the tourism and airline industry. It is going to be a long and slow recovery. And while the government has been very good at kind of thinking 2 months out and having 2-month kind of relief supports that they got out to workers and other interim measures, they haven't so far successfully dealt with this larger problem of these particular sectors. They're going to have a very long and slow recovery. We're talking 2022, 2023, possibly up to 2024. And so how do you stabilize not only the industry, but stabilize the workers and the workers that have worked in that industry, some for up to decades? So that is the problem. Right now, we know that the wage subsidy program, the CEWS, was originally bankrolled, I think, at $80 billion. It's gone up since then, although we don't have a full number of what the cost would be. And we know that only like $35 billion of that has rolled out the door. Employers aren't really taking it up as much as they need to be to keep employees on board, and also to keep some of the infrastructure, not only the infrastructure of the industry and the sector, but the workers who have the skills and the expertise tied to that sector. So the government, I think, frankly, this move by WestJet today, and we've seen in the past regional route cancellations by Air Canada and Porter suspensions, and I think really it is about kind of building up a head of steam and pushing the government to a point, to a brink, where they will have to come out with the sectoral packages soon. We saw in the speech from the throne, page 19, they said they were going to deliver support for those regional routes. And so now it's time, and I think this one way with the cancellation and with drawing the ire of somebody like Tim Powers not being able to go
quaking in their boots, yeah.
Yeah, so I think they should be quaking in their boots. So I think this is one of the things, and I think we should actually expect something soon.
Okay.
And the tourism, and I would say airline, is unique among the sectors.
That's true. Yes, Tim, go for it.
No, the quick last word, as you burn me in effigy, as they do in Newfoundland and Labrador for dare challenging the orthodoxy of the bubble, is this. There's also regionalism in this too, right? And you saw this in Dennis King, the P.E.I. Premier's press release. It's about being connected. So what the premiers are going to say, never mind the bubble and all of that. You can't cut us off, because if you do, you're failing to live up to your constitutional responsibilities of providing us with service, regular service. The other political element to that regionalism, as Amanda well knows, Atlantic Canada is still very much a bastion of the federal Liberal Party. There are very strong federal ministers there, and Atlantic Canada stood strong with the Liberal Party in its darkest hours, and the Prime Minister has always remembered that. So if there's ever going to be an opportunity for the airlines to capitalize on regional anxiety, it is in Atlantic Canada.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.